That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right, welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I am your host, Bill Rader, and joining me as always is my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, how's it going today?
Billy Raids, we're doing good, buddy.
All right, sounds good. Hey, we've got a great guest. Jim DiEugenio has joined us. This is his second appearance on our podcast. Jim, welcome.
Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining. We've got, the last time we talked to you, we talked a lot about the documentary, and there were so many things that we wanted to get to last time that we didn't have an opportunity to. So we can. We'll touch on a bunch of that today, including the autopsy and a couple questions I have for you, Jim, about some of the interviews I've seen with doctors who were there at Parkland. But Sean, I know you wanted to start off with a question for Jim.
Yeah, Jim, the first thing I'm going to ask you is if you could talk just quickly about your terrific article you have at your website, Kennedy's and King, about the upcoming movie with Al Pacino and the 1960 election crap. If you could just touch on that, because that article is just tremendous. I recommend everybody to read it.
Okay, this is at kennedysandking.com, which is the website that I publish, and it's called Al Pacino, John Travolta, and the Giancana Myth. All right, and it's a two-part article. The first part essentially deals with the life of Giancana, all right? And the second part of it deals with the whole mythology, which is a kind word. An unkind word would be bullshit, okay, that's been surfaced about Giancana and the Kennedy case, okay, ever since about the 1980s, all right? And most prominently in the 1992 novel, Double Cross. I won't even call it a book because it's not a book, it's a novel, all right? And that was written by Giancana's half-brother, Chuck Giancana, and I think his grandnephew, Sam Giancana, all right? And in that book, what they did is they built upon a previous mythology, okay, that was first offered by People magazine in, I believe, 1988, okay, by Judith Exner and Kitty Kelly, all right? Namely, that somehow Exner was delivering money and information about votes for the West Virginia election and the Chicago election, and also, if you can believe this, about the assassination plots against Castro. All right, well, Double Cross essentially built on that, okay, and except they expanded it to say that somehow this plot to steal the election of 1960 was fostered by the fact that Joe Kennedy had been in the bootleg business. All right. Now, what's so odd about this is that the MSM picked up on double cross, like it was true. Like everything these two guys were writing about through Giancana, was true and accurate. Okay. When in fact, none of it was. None of it was. Okay. Let's first start with John Binder's excellent article, which I believe was posted in 2006. Okay. Organized Crime and the 1960 Election, I believe is the name of it. And you can find this on the web just by Googling John Binder and the 1960 election. He ran some figures, okay, from both the 1956, the 1960, and also thirdly, the 1964 election, okay, to show that there was no uptick in Democratic turnout in the 5 wards that were allegedly controlled by the Chicago outfit, which of course was being run by Giancana at that time. All right. Okay. The only election that there was any uptick in was the one that they wanted to defeat a Republican attorney general, a guy named Adamowski. All right, because he was cracking down on the outfit in Chicago. All right. All right. So there was no increase in turnout in comparatively speaking. So where was this huge effort to get out the vote? And in fact, what Binder found is that in some instances it was even less. Which indicated to him that they were really actually going against JFK. All right, which would make perfect sense because of his service with his brother on the McClellan Committee, sometimes called the Rackets Committee, that was cracking down on organized crime. All right. Now, in addition to that, as far as West Virginia goes, all right, there's 2 good books on this. All right. One by Dan Fleming called Humphrey versus Kennedy, West Virginia, 1960. The other one is Just Good Politics by a guy named Ray Chafin. All right. Fleming is an academic study. Okay. Plus, he did a lot of on the ground investigation. All right. He could not find any trace of the guy that in Double Cross they say Giancana sent to West Virginia, a guy named Skinny D'Amato. He did about 80 interviews. He even went into areas that were very shady, okay, and violent areas, okay, and he could not find the hide nor hair of any influence by Giancana or Skinny D'Amato in that election. He also notes that there were 3 inquiries into that election, all right, one by the state authorities, okay, one by the FBI, and one by Barry Goldwater, all right, and none of them came up with anything saying that there was anything illegal or unethical done in that election, all right. Now, don't tell me, please, that Barry Goldwater didn't want to come up with something because he was getting ready to run against Kennedy, okay,
Right.
in the 64 election.
Yep.
But he couldn't come up with anything either, all right? All right. Now, in the Chafin book, Good Politics, he was a very big union leader in the western part of West Virginia, all right? And so he had an inside take on what happened there. He said he was predisposed to go for Humphrey in that election. And by the way, the only reason Kennedy even entered that election, because Bobby Kennedy didn't really want to enter West Virginia. Okay. But Humphrey said that he was going to enter, and it was a predominantly Protestant state. Okay. And so Bobby Kennedy said, let's show the public that we can win in a state that's not predominantly Catholic. Okay. All right. And so that's the reason they got in. Chafin was predisposed for Humphrey. But what happened was that Kennedy asked to meet with him. All right. And Kennedy did a very smart thing, him and his brother. Okay. They said, look, whatever Humphrey's offering you, we will do it better. Okay. All right. We will one up him. All right. So the benefits that you accrue if we win will be greater under us than under him. And so Chafin said, well, that makes sense. All right. And so he switched over to Kennedy. Then, and this is what's really important, okay, they asked him, how much will you need for your ward to cinch it for us? And so he added it up, okay, and we're going to send out flyers. We need to hire people to take old people who have no cars, to the polls, etc. All right. And so he said 35, meaning 3,500. A week before the election, Bobby Kennedy delivered a couple of big briefcases full of money to him. Okay. It was 35,000. And so he realized they had mistaken how much money he was going to need. Okay. And so what he did is he couldn't spend it all. Okay. So what he did is he started calling these other areas and saying, do you need any money? Okay. And so he spent like all day driving around West Virginia delivering this money to these other precinct chairmen and ward chairmen in order to get out the vote. Okay. All right. And so that's one big reason, okay, that they won that state. All right. Now, to get to this other double cross BS, okay, which I've written about before. Look, the idea that Joe Kennedy would want to get into bootlegging in 1919 through the 20s, et cetera, okay, is so much crapola that, it really makes me a little bit sick, okay? Joe Kennedy, at around 1919, about the year that Prohibition was passed, okay, was working at Hayden Stone. Hayden Stone was the largest stockbroking operation in New England. Okay. All right. And he was learning the ropes about and by the way, insider trading was legal at that time. Okay. And he was learning all the ropes of stock market manipulation, and how to go ahead and hedge your bets, etc., find clients, okay, and then go ahead and find good stocks to buy from a lot of the information that was coming into that firm. Okay. Outside of Wall Street, it was the biggest one in that area. All right. Well, Joe Kennedy made so much money off of Hayden Stone. And the other thing was getting into was buying properties that were going to go into foreclosure. Okay. He was very good at that also. He made so much money off those two areas, okay, that he then moved his family to New York City. All right. And then got into the movie business. And when I say he got into the movie business, I mean, he really got into the movie business. With all the money that he made working for Hayden Stone, he actually decided to buy a set of theaters in New England, all right, that he could exhibit films. He then opened up a whole new office and bought a new home on get this, if you know anything about Los Angeles, on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, okay? All right, let me say that again. Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. All right. Okay. So, and both homes in New York City and in Los Angeles, he had chauffeurs, he had limousines. I think he actually bought a Rolls Royce. Okay. He had a set of servants, etc. All right. Joe Kennedy, at once in 1 year, he distributed 51 movies. Okay. 51 movies.
Wow.
Now, back then, today I think there's something like 5,000 theaters in the United States. Back then, there were 20,000 theaters. So if you're distributing 51 pictures at 20,000 theaters, I mean, you're like, you have a license to print money.
Hmm.
Now, why do I say that? I know a little bit about the movie business. Okay. All right. If you want to make the most money in the movie business, it's not by owning a theater and it's not by working in the movie business. It's by distribution. You know why? Because when you're distributing movies, you get cut in on the first dollar. Okay. The first week or so, it's usually an 80-20 split between the distributor and the exhibitor. In other words, the guy who owns the theater. It's 80-20 in favor of the distributor. Okay. Now, if you're distributing 51 movies to thousands and thousands of theaters, okay, and the attendance for movies back then was phenomenal, okay, you can imagine the kind of money this guy was making. The ratio goes down the longer the movie is in the theaters. It'll go down to 70-30. It'll go down to 60-40. It'll go down to 50-50. I think the lowest it goes is 40-60 in favor of the exhibitor. Okay. But that's the kind of money this guy was making. And on top of that, he was so successful that companies hired him to be their chief executive officers. I think it was three distribution companies ended up hiring Joe Kennedy. And he was so successful and so in demand that he was able to dictate his own terms. So not only did he get a lot of money as a salary, he demanded stock options in the company, which meant that you could trade those options at any time. You didn't have to cash them in immediately. You could
Right.
pick and choose your time that
Right.
you wanted. And from his experience at Hayden Stone, of course, he would know, okay, when to sell them. All right. Now, on top of that, he never got out of the real estate business, okay, because he bought the merchandise mart in Chicago for, I think, $12 million. All right. Well, I don't have to tell you how much 12 million back
And-
then versus
Yeah,
today.
what year was that?
Okay. The merchandise mart, which I think was the biggest office building in the whole Midwest. All right. That was estimated in value in 2007 at close to $1 billion.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now the Kennedy family sold it before that. Okay. But I'm just trying to point out what an incredible investment that was. Okay. So you're going to tell me, oh, by the way, Joe Kennedy did get into the liquor business later.
Right.
Okay. But it was after Prohibition had been repealed. Okay. So the idea that Joe Kennedy would want to get in something illegal when he's making money hand over fist doing something legal is so bizarre, and on top of that, in Daniel O'Krent's book, Last Call, okay, which is one of the best histories of the Prohibition era, he went through all the FBI documents, the file on Joe Kennedy, all right? And because what had happened is whenever a president appoints somebody, an outside advisor, to work for him, like Roosevelt did with Joe Kennedy. I think Truman did it twice. I think Eisenhower did it once. They appointed him to do certain jobs in the federal government. Okay. And so there has to be an investigation. And Daniel O'Krent went through these, I think it's over 800 pages, all right, stemming all the way back from the 20s, okay, and the early 30s, okay? No, the early 30s, that would be correct, because Roosevelt got elected in 1932. This was right after Prohibition was repealed, okay? And he went through all the documents. He says there's not one single word about anybody saying that Joe Kennedy was in the illegal liquor business during Prohibition. Okay. Now, realistically, you would figure somebody would want to get on the record about what Joe Kennedy had done illegally. You know, some low level or high level mobster, etc., would want to say something. Okay. Well, there's nothing in there at all, period. Okay. So this whole thing, you know, that double cross uh, reaped into the MSM is, I think, nothing but an old wives' tale. All right, and and it was begun by these mobsters. Okay, they're the one who put it in there. I think Joe Costello was the first person to put it into a book. I mean, you look, you can read stuff. I read one book where the guy interviewed some mobster, and the mobster said, I was visiting Havana in 1958, and I saw Senator Kennedy with a call girl through a two-way mirror. Okay. You know, sodium amytal and copulating. Okay. Okay. Sure. All right. Yeah. I'll believe that. Okay. And so,
Right. We'll play along.
okay, here's a guy who could probably have any woman that he wanted. Okay.
Right. And he's got a hooker.
Yeah. And then he has to go, okay, sure. Okay. Right. And he goes to Havana. All right. And so in the article, I said, look, it's pretty obvious what this is. Okay. It's a bunch of gangsters who truly resented being exposed, demeaned, and ridiculed on national television, because that the McClellan Committee was nationally televised. Okay. You know, and put in jail, you know, by the Kennedy family. And it's their way of reaping the whirlwind. Okay. And in the article, if you read the article, it was Bobby Kennedy's relentless surveillance of Giancana, which really was the beginning of the end for Giancana.
Right.
Okay. Because Hoover had cut the Get Giancana squad in Chicago from 10 to 5. Okay. And when Bobby Kennedy became Attorney General, he sent 65 agents to Chicago.
Wow. Wow.
He went up by 1,400%. And when I say that they had total surveillance on Giancana, they had total surveillance on Giancana.
Right.
I talk about it there in the article. When he would arrive in town from traveling outside, they would meet him at the airport. They would drive home with him right behind his car. Then when he would go home, they would put 3 cars on his house at night. Okay. You know, when he would go walk down to the park, they would follow him down to the park. When he would go to a restaurant, they would be in the table right next to him. When he would go to the bathroom, the FBI agent would take the urinal next to Giancana. Okay.
Yep.
You know, when they would go golfing, okay, these guys would be right behind them, and they would like hit balls into Giancana's foursome. All right, just to get closer to him. And finally, Giancana went to court.
Right.
He couldn't take it. All right, and so he actually went to court. You know, but what happened was, unlike what Colosi says in his so-called documentary, Momo, The Life of Sam Giancana, which I based the article on, okay, he did not win that case. What happened is that Bobby Kennedy decided not to put on a defense because he did not believe a lower court could overrule a Department of Justice decision. He thought it was unconstitutional. So he appealed the case and he won it on appeal. But in the interim, what the FBI did, because the original judge had put some limitations on the surveillance, okay, he went to the local sheriff, a guy named Richard Ogilvy, who was very much anti-Giancana, okay, and he said, look, you make up the difference that the judge overruled us on, okay? And he said he agreed to do it. So in other words, the surveillance never really lessened, okay? So then with all this surveillance on now on Giancana, all right, they decided to put him on the stand and leave him a choice of either telling the truth or immunizing him. And if he refused to answer, they would bust him for contempt, that's what happened. They busted him for contempt. All right. And he knew once he got out of jail that they would do the same thing over. All right. And so he fled to Mexico. That's what happened. That's how they got rid of him.
Yeah.
All right, he fled to Cuernavaca, Mexico, then San Cristobal. All right. But his lawyer down there failed to get permanent legal residence for Giancana. And so they kicked him out in 1974, I believe. And then the FBI actually met him at the airport again. Okay, when he got off the plane. All right, and Giancana said, "Look, I'm not going to get into any more stuff anymore," because he knew that he had lost his power. They see, the thing is, the two big guys who were really the outside leaders of the Chicago mob, Accardo and Rica, okay,
Right.
they did not like the fact that Giancana was making all these headlines. Okay, they believed, and they were correct, that look, we work better in the dark. Okay, when nobody knows about us.
Right.
All right, this guy's getting his picture taken with Phyllis McGuire, okay, in Las Vegas.
Right.
All right, and so this was, they didn't want any more of Sam Giancana, and so I believe that when he got back and he said he was not going to rot in jail, and they called him for 4 grand juries, and they were going to call him before the church committee, and he did not want to cut in a cardo on some of the things that he had done down in Mexico. I think that was the reason they killed him. Okay.
So, Jim, I mean, even if the theory was, well, if we deliver Kennedy this election, they'll back off. They'll back off what we're doing. Clearly, that didn't happen. That should have been case closed right there. Why do you think
it's so stupid to even proffer that idea?
Right.
Okay.
So why do you think it continues though to this day? Where they're to the point where they're making
because the MSM. Oh, okay. This is my idea. And I actually, when I did Coast to Coast one night with Oliver, some reporter from the LA Times and the Orange County Register, he got on to ask me a question later. Okay. And he started trashing JFK. And the first thing he brought up was that election thing in 1960.
Yeah.
See, this is what I believe. This is how this game works. Okay. The MSM will never get over the fact that they blew the JFK case. All right. And they'll never get over the fact that everybody knows it except them. Okay. Because they can't admit it.
Right.
They blew the case. Not only did they blew the JFK case, they blew the whole Vietnam angle. Okay. Right. Here you go. In November of 1964, the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission are published. 3 months later, Johnson is sending the first troops to Da Nang. And somehow there's no connection. Okay. What JFK will never do in 3 years, all right, LBJ was doing in 3 months. And you guys missed the story. All right. And so they lap onto this stuff as a way of negating their previous failure. The other thing is, see, by that time, I believe Double Cross was 1992. By that time, the tabloidization of the MSM had begun. In fact, I think it began a couple years earlier myself. Okay. In other words, pressures from other outlets began to turn the MSM more tabloidish, okay, than
Right.
it had ever been before. Okay. And so therefore there was no cross-checking. There was no questioning. Let's just go for it. This is red meat. Okay. And let me give you a specific example of this. See, as when I wrote about Seymour Hersh a few weeks before, his book, The Dark Side of Camelot, one of the very worst books ever written about Kennedy
Yeah,
or the
definitely.
assassination, he latched onto all this stuff about this whole deal in Chicago. Except the thing is, at the end of that review, I said, you know something? Which deal do you want to pick? Because there's 5 different versions of this, of how this
Right.
happened, you know?
Right.
So, which means, look, if 5 different versions, it means it didn't happen. They're just
Right.
making stuff up one after another, and they're not coordinating their stories. All right. And so, what happened there, if you recall, if you read the article,
Mm-hmm.
see, Seymour Hersh was writing an absolute hatchet job. All right. And so he lapped on to this other BS story that was in the Giancana book about Marilyn Monroe.
Right.
And so if you had Don McGovern on your show,
We
you know
did.
that
Yeah.
what a bunch of crap that is.
Yep.
Okay. All right. And so when ABC bought Hirsch's book to make a film out of it, a documentary out of it, they did not inspect the book before they bought the book.
Mm.
All right. In other words, they did not do due diligence. They just bought the book. All right. And they didn't understand what was awaiting for them. And what was awaiting for them was that Seymour Hersh had bought into the Lex Cusack story. The whole thing about JFK and Janet de Rosiers and Marilyn Monroe and Aaron Frosch, Marilyn Monroe's lawyer, okay, and Joe Kennedy signing into this trust that Kennedy would take care of Marilyn Monroe's mother in return for her not saying anything about their relationship or the fact that she had seen him in the company of several mobsters. Okay. Well, the fact that Marilyn Monroe didn't know any mobsters, Hirsch just didn't consider that. But okay. And so what happened is once ABC submitted the documents to, I think it was 3 forensic experts, they all came to the conclusion that it was a fraud. And by the way, Hirsch had been told that beforehand by Janet de Rosiers, who was a secretary working for the Kennedy family. Okay. And she had been named in these documents, and Hirsch had shown her the documents. And she said, wait a minute, that's not my signature. I never met Marilyn Monroe. Okay.
Wow.
So obviously I never signed off on this thing.
Yeah.
This is a forgery.
Right.
But Hirsch didn't listen to her. Okay. Said, the usual Kennedy apologist. Right. Okay. And so that blew up on them. That blew up on ABC. All right. And so Peter Jennings, who was a host of that show, and I've done some reading on this, Peter Jennings really took this personally. And they did everything they could to protect Seymour Hersh. Okay. And their exposure with the story, because they had to admit it, all right, that Hersh was only on, I think it was a nighttime special. He was only on for less than like 3 minutes. They really didn't go into how he had failed to do due diligence on those documents himself, or how Janet de Rosiers had told him about that. They were covering up for him, really. All right. And so Peter Jennings really took this personally. All right. But then he fell for another Hirsch BS story. All right. That somehow Exner had a witness to her going back and forth between Washington and Chicago with documents and money, etc. Okay.
Mm.
All right. A guy named Martin Underwood. Well, Underwood refused to appear. He's in Hirsch's book. He refused to appear on the show, but they didn't. Peter Jennings didn't explain why. Okay. Well, when the ARB, the Assassination Record Review Board, interviewed Underwood, he explained that I never did any of that stuff. I never saw any of that stuff that they said that I saw. Okay. So in other words, that's another part of the story that blew up on Hirsch and Jennings. Okay. And I truly believe that this is the reason that Jennings went ahead with the 2003 special
Right.
that ABC put on. And one of the reasons I believe it's so is because he hired Gus Russo to be the lead investigator, and Russo had worked for Seymour Hirsch. So I believe what happened is that Hirsch recommended, Jennings said, I'm going to do an anti-JFK special. Okay, no conspiracy. And he asked Hirsch, and he recommended Russo. All right, it was his way of somehow evening the score on this. All right, this is what I mean about the MSM. That's a perfect example of what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense.
So Jim, go ahead, Bill.
But yeah, I think I think we want to change direction a little bit here. We want to kind of get into the autopsy. Sean, do you have any questions or
No, just I recommend everybody to read that article because it's fantastic. And before that movie comes out, definitely read that article. But Jim, let's get to the autopsy. So let's start at Parkland Hospital and some of the things the doctors seen there, and then I want to get to how the body was basically taken away with guns drawn to Bethesda.
Well, okay, in the film, JFK Revisited, and especially in the long version, JFK Destiny Betrayed, and in the book, which came out of the film, JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass, we spent a lot of time on this because the ARB did a re-review of, and by the way, it's interesting why they did this. When the ARB was setting up, what happened is Stokes, the chairman of the House Select Committee, visited with Thunheim, the chairman of the ARB, and he said, I really think you should do a review of the medical evidence, because I was never satisfied and nobody else was very satisfied with what the House Select Committee did on that score. And that's how the ARB review began. So this is one of the reasons we had Doug Horn in the film, okay? Because he was one of the two people, along with Jeremy Gunn, who reviewed the medical evidence in the JFK case. And this is why we have an interview with him both in the film and in the book. All right. If you take a look at what happened at Parkland Hospital, which is a place that the Secret Service brought Kennedy's body to right after the shooting in Dealey Plaza. If you take a look at those witnesses and their closest testimony as to when they first saw the body from the very first day, very quickly you will see that this posed some very serious problems for the people who were in charge of the cover-up, okay? Because so many witnesses saw a blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull.
Right, yeah.
All right? That was number one. You had approximately 8 witnesses who saw cerebellum. Cerebellum is at the lower part of the brain, actually underneath the brain proper. Okay, and it differs in texture, it differs in coloration. Okay, and that would indicate that the hole in the back of the skull was quite low, not high like the House Select Committee switched it to.
Right.
All right, but quite low in the back of the skull.
So Jim, I actually watched, there was an interview, it was about 10 years ago. And I don't know if both of these doctors may have since passed away, but there was a Dr. McClellan and a Dr. Jones who were in trauma room 1. Dr. McClellan, I think, was the doctor who had the closest proximity to the wound in the back of the head, and his opinion was that there was no chance that the bullet entered from the back, that it had to have come from the front, because he had never seen a wound that size caused by an entrance wound that size. He also said that that as he was standing there, the brain actually fell out of the hole. That's how big the hole was in the back of his head. It actually fell out onto the cart.
I think he said pieces of cerebellum were falling down.
Is that okay? Okay.
And they had a drainage pail there on the
Yeah.
floor.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then, well, I mean, that's very powerful evidence.
Of
Okay.
course.
You know, that there was a hole in the back of Kennedy's skull. All right. Now, what happens is after Kennedy, and how could I miss this? And Malcolm Perry did the tracheotomy,
The throat wound, yeah.
which was in the front of Kennedy anterior neck wound. Okay. And he had the closest view of that wound. And on that day, there was a press conference. All right. After Kennedy's body had left Parkland Hospital under duress, which we'll get to later. All right. And so what happened is Kemp Clark, who was the chief of neurosurgery, talked about this wound in the back of Kennedy's skull. Now, this is the chief of neurosurgery at Parkland. If he's saying there was a blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull, I think he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then Perry said, he was asked 3 times, when you did the tracheotomy and looked at the wound, what did you think about the orientation of that wound? And he said, it looked to me to be one of entrance. All right. So these 2 statements by Clark and Perry posed a very, very serious problem. All right. And in fact, this is why people have said the Secret Service picked up the films of that press conference, because there isn't any film left of that press conference. Okay. It disappeared by about 1967, maybe earlier.
Oh boy.
Right. And so what happens next is that everybody in Texas knew that if there's a murder, okay, that there has to be an autopsy in Texas. That was the law. There was no federal law on this issue at that time. Right. Okay. But there was a very, very strong resistance, okay, to keeping the body at Parkland Hospital. Now, Rose, who was the medical examiner, his office was right in the hospital on the first floor. And he was insisting, no, look, this is a state crime. Okay, I have to do an autopsy here. Okay. And there began this incredible argument. Okay. And when I say an argument, that's probably an understatement. Okay. In Manchester's book, The Death of a President, he talks about this. All right. And he says, he heard stories where it wasn't just a shouting argument. People were pushing people around. The Secret Service had their hands on their guns.
Yeah.
Okay. And there was no way that Earl Rose was going to be able to do the autopsy as he wanted to do as a matter of law at Parkland Hospital. Now, that's an important point, because unlike these 3 guys who are going to do the autopsy in Bethesda, Rose was very well admired for his skill, okay, as an autopsist, as a pathologist. All right. And I believe, and I think a lot of other people believe, that if Kennedy had the autopsy in Texas, that would have been a good autopsy. That would have stood up in court. All right. So this was a very, very important key to why this ended up such a mess. All right. So then, after Earl Rose is essentially overrun, They go ahead and get on the plane and they go to Bethesda.
So, Jim, before we get there, though, I want to add a little bit of color to what you were talking about with the chaotic nature of what was going on there. The other doctor that was on that interview, Dr. Jones, I believe his name was, he was charged with putting the IV into Kennedy. Now, obviously, we know that wouldn't have done anything, but he said he couldn't eat. There were so many people in trauma room 1, people that should not have been there, people in suits that were not doctors, that I'm assuming were Secret Service. But he couldn't even get to Kennedy to start the IV. That's how chaotic it was in there. He said Mrs. Kennedy was outside trauma room 1. And there were so many people in a small room that he could not even get to Kennedy to start the IV. That just seems insane to me.
Yeah, yeah, that one's new to me. Okay, I never heard that one before.
Yeah,
and it's going to get worse at Bethesda, of course, because the military is going to control the autopsy. Correct, Jim?
Yes, that, we talked about this at length in the film and in the book. Humes, Boswell, and Fink ended up being the 3 doctors, okay, who were going to be in charge of the autopsy that night. Now, we talked about this a lot in both the book and the film. There's very little evidence that Humes ever did, Jim Humes, who was the chief autopsist that night, that he ever did a full gunshot wound autopsy, and I believe that Humes actually tried to conceal the fact that he had not done one. All right. He was more or less an administrator. He was a desk jockey. Okay. Boswell might have done 1 or 2, but not recently. Okay. Now, I'm not saying these guys didn't know basic anatomy. I'm not saying that at all. They did. They were doctors, okay, and they oversaw pathological studies, all right? But they really were not experienced or practiced enough to do what was supposed to be a good job on a very important case and a complex case, all right? They asked to have a private pathologist come in. That was denied. As we talked about with Cyril Wecht in the film, everybody knows that in the whole Washington to New York axis, there were several experienced medical examiners, okay, who could have been called, but none of them were. There was the great Milton Halpern in New York City. And according to Cyril, he actually started packing his bags that day because for sure they thought they were going to call him.
Right.
Okay. No. And he had put together a list of the people he wanted to assist him on the case. All right. Well, they call in Pierre Fink. All right. And Pierre Fink at that time was another administrator. All right. And he arrived late. People talk about how late he was. Was he 15 minutes late? Was he 45 minutes late? All right. But he arrived belatedly. And he was like the 3rd guy on the totem pole. All right. During the actual autopsy. Now, let's get to the very serious problem here. Nobody knows how many people were in the gallery that night. Because although the FBI did pass a list around, they admitted, Siebert and O'Neill, that not everybody signed the list. So the low ball is 33 people. I believe there were probably over 40.
Wow.
Okay. There were probably over 40 people in that gallery. Now, why you would need over 40 people in the gallery that night. That escapes me. All right. I don't know why. I have no understanding of that, why they were allowed in, etc. All right. But if you take a look at the autopsy and all the things that should have been done versus what was done, and you take a look at all the mistakes in the protocol, all right, to say that this was an incompetent job, I don't think renders it accurate. And in fact, when I interviewed Al Lewis, who was on the House Select Committee, all right, he was in the initial stages. He was, along with Bob Tannenbaum and Richard Sprague, he was a top three on the Kennedy side. And I mentioned this issue to him. Okay. And I said how bad it was. I mentioned Harold Weisberg, saying that JFK got the autopsy of a Bowery bomb. And Al Lewis fired back right at me and he said it's worse than that. So, in other words, it's not me saying it was worse than incompetent. It was his highly experienced attorney, okay, who did a lot of murder cases, all right, who's saying that, right? So here you get into things that were covered up initially. The examination of the 3 autopsy doctors by the Warren Commission was a joke. I mean, there's no way in the world you're going to tell me that a guy as smart as Arlen Specter only thought that there were 12 relevant questions he could ask Boswell. I'm sorry, I don't believe it, and so I believe that what happened is that Specter knew that there were a lot of very serious problems with what happened at Bethesda, and it was his job to conceal them. And I believe that that is what he did. It's the only way to explain his performance. Okay. I mean, he never interviewed either the radiologist or the photographer, if you can believe that. That's very, very telling. He never interviewed Ebersol. He never interviewed Stringer. All right. And this is one reason that the Warren Report is a joke.
Jim, could you get into a little bit on Stringer or what you put in the movie on John Stringer? Because that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. John Stringer was the autopsy photographer of record, okay, during the Kennedy autopsy. He was very experienced, okay, and he was actually a teacher of autopsy photography. Well, when the ARB interviewed Stringer in the 90s, Jeremy Gunn and Doug Horn had really done their homework on this issue. And they did a very smart thing, all right? They got Stringer on the record before they showed him the evidence, okay? In other words, they wanted all the information he could give them before confronting him with the actual evidence in the case, all right? So that he couldn't change his story. So after they got all the details, like what kind of film did you use, what kind of process did you use, etc. All right, how long did it take? Was there anybody else, and all that stuff? They brought in the actual pictures. All right, and this is, of course, one of the high points of the ARB. And I believe one of the most interesting parts of both the film and the book, all right, is this interview with Stringer. And as Doug Horn described it, because he was there, all right, he said, Jeremy asked him, he says, is this the kind of film you used? And Stringer actually walked up to the pictures, all right, and according to Doug Horn, he was very excited, okay, and he said, this is an ectochrome. Okay, this this is Ansco. Or I think, she said words to the effect, I think this is Ansco, which is a different kind of film, of course. All right. And he says, you see these numbers at the bottom corner here? See, that means this was part of a press pack. In a press pack, what you do is you put a lot of film on top of each other and you take a series of pictures that are numbered. He goes, I didn't use a press pack. All right. I took separate pictures. And so Jeremy Gunn then asks him, are you ready to deny that you took these pictures? And Stringer says, if that's Ansco and that's a press pack, I didn't take these pictures. Okay, so and
Wow.
so as we said in the film,
Yeah.
you know, if he didn't take the pictures, then who did? And
Right.
why did you have to have a different photographer for those pictures? And the thing is, what's so if anything shows you how bad the Warren Commission report was, it's that we had to wait, and I should say the House Select Committee also, that we had to wait until the mid-90s to find out one of the most important things about this case, that Stringer says he didn't think that he took the pictures. Okay. All right. Oh, and there was also the thing about the cerebellum. He also said that. Okay.
Yeah.
He said that he did see cerebellum.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So he's another witness to that.
So Jim, and I want to get to the brain and the adventure with that. But before we do that, there's one question I have for you. So one of the doctors in that interview that I saw, and again, that interview was on YouTube. I believe it was jfk.org was the website, and I forget who it was that conducted the interview. What one of these doctors said was, in the Warren report was from I guess, is it Commander Hume? Is that the forensic pathologist who James Hume? What he said was that the shot, the neck wound, that he claimed that the fibers in the rear of, so in the back of the neck, the fibers went in, and that in the front, the fibers went out, which is consistent with the entrance wound being from behind and the exit wound being in the front, which is what essentially convinced this doctor that the Warren report was legitimate. So, and
Hume said that?
Yes, he apparently that's what.
No, it wasn't
How
Hume.
how could he say that?
It was Jones, wasn't it?
No, Jones said that Hume had.
No, Jones was from Dallas.
Right. Jones said that Hume had put that in the had told that to the Warren Commission, that was part of his report, that was in the Warren Commission, that the fibers in the rear went in and then the front they came out. Now, what the other doctor said is what made that difficult to believe was that there was actually an incision where the wound in the front was. I forget who the doctor was that did the incision in the front, but that made it very difficult to tell whether that wound in the front could have been an entrance wound or an exit wound.
You know, these guys are so desperate. You know, look, you know why that's so hard to swallow is because the Secret Service wouldn't give the doctors the clothing that night. Okay, Fink testified about this to the ARB. I think into the HSCA also. He wanted to take a look at the clothes, and the Secret Service wouldn't let them look at the clothes. Okay, and you're absolutely correct. If you look at the pictures of the JFK shirt, you'll see that it looks like what happened was somebody opened up the front of his neck right behind the tie with a scalpel.
Right. Yes, that's what he said.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea that you could dictate directionality with a hole in the shirt that was made by a scalpel, okay, that's that's not going to fly anyplace. All right, you know, and like I said, these are just acts of desperation. you know.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think again, but that's why this, this Warren report was so misleading to so many doctors, because it was, a lot of
we
things
we
were.
wouldn't have these problems if the wound had been dissected. That's the main point.
Yeah.
Okay, neither wound was dissected. All right, and this is what when I interviewed Henry Lee. Okay, when I did a pre-interview with Henry Lee out at Malibu. Okay, before the show went on, and I asked him about this. Okay, I asked him about trajectory analysis. All right, because we were thinking of doing that. And Henry Lee said very flat out, you can't do it in the Kennedy case. And I said, why not? And he goes, because neither wound was dissected. He goes, if neither wound is dissected and it's just guesswork,
Yeah.
you're just guessing, you know. And I actually said, because I was kind of surprised. Well, because look, here's the best reconstruction guy in all of criminology in America. The guy's testified in like 40 states, 32 foreign countries. He's written 30 books. He had his own TV show. Okay. And he did 1,000 gunshot wound autopsies. Well, not autopsies, but he comes in and he tries to reconstruct the crime for the authorities.
Yeah.
Right. And he's telling me that, no, you can't do it. Well, he's probably right. Okay. Off of his experience. All right. And so this is the problem. Okay. And so all these people like Dale Myers who go ahead and try and do a trajectory on the JFK case, it's essentially, it's smoking marijuana by yourself.
Right.
All right.
Right.
It's just not, there's no way you can do. And the reason is even worse is because what they leave out is that the reason that there was no dissection is that they wouldn't let Humes do one. And we found that out at the trial of Clayshaw in 1969, where Garrison repeatedly asked Fink, okay, why did you not dissect the back wound? All right. And he didn't want an answer. And finally, the judge had to order him to answer the question. Okay. And by the way, when I say refused to answer, he dodged a question about 8 times. All right. And finally, when he was forced to answer, he said, because we were stopped from doing that. And then this whole story about all the military presence entered the story. Now, as far as the head wound goes, about the brain, look, I'm really glad Oliver put all this stuff in about the brain, because I think it's an extraordinarily part of the story, which again, the Warren Commission completely missed, and so did the House Select Committee completely miss. All right. Kennedy's brain was not weighed that night. Let me say that again. Kennedy's brain was not weighed that night, which is very strange, because this is when you're beginning an autopsy, one of the things you do is you take out the brain from the brain casing and you weigh the brain, especially in a gunshot wound case like this.
Yeah.
All right. It wasn't weighed that night. The first record we have of the weight of Kennedy's brain is 1,500 grams. Now,
Impossible. It's impossible.
Now, let me ask a question. Everybody listening to this show has seen the Zapruder film, and you've seen the pictures of the back of Kennedy's car, and you've seen Jackie Kennedy go out the back of the car because she had a panic attack and she wanted to retrieve part of Kennedy's brain. And she actually brought it to the hospital and gave it to the doctors. Okay. You've seen the great head explosion in the Zapruder film. We know the motorcycle guy on the left side of Kennedy got hit with brain matter so hard that he thought it was a projectile. It ended up being between his teeth. Okay.
Oh my God.
All right. And we know all the witnesses at both Bethesda and Parkland who say a great amount of Kennedy's brain was gone. Okay, and these estimates go, from 1/3 of the brain being gone up to 1/2 of the brain being gone. All right. All right. And we know that Jenkins, excuse me, said the brain was so decimated that he could barely put the perfusion tubes. He couldn't find enough space to put the perfusion tubes in. This is how you formulate the brain and you solid it up so it can be dissected. Okay. So the idea that Kennedy's brain would weigh above the average,
Right.
above the average, okay, is, I believe, completely untenable. All right. I just don't believe the combination of this plus Stringer would have blown out the case against that being Kennedy's brain. All right. All right. Now, on top of this, of course, you have the fact that there was no dissection. There was no dissection. And if you read the Warren report, as Cyril Weck so eloquently put in the film, okay, he said to preserve the specimen. And Weck, you remember what Weck says? Preserve the specimen for what?
Yeah,
Exactly.
To put it in a museum so Jackie Kennedy can put it on her fireplace? Preserve the specimen for what?
Right.
Okay. And so what you do is after you have perfused the brain with formaldehyde, you then do one of two ways to dissect the brain. There's either what they call a bread cut, okay? That is, you cut it like a loaf of bread, or what they call a pie cut, where you cut it like different axes, through the pie angles. All right. And the reason you do this, of course, is because this allows you to find directionality, okay, to see if the bullet penetrated all the way through, and to see if there was more than one bullet. Okay. Well, somebody didn't want that done. Somebody didn't want that done because there was no dissection of the brain, just like there was no dissection of the back wound. Okay. So in other words, we have to debate this. And remember, we're coming up on 60 years now. Did these bullets transit the body? Did they stay in the body? Okay. How many bullets hit Kennedy in the head? It sure as heck looks like more than one from the Zapruder film.
Right.
All right. Okay. And this is the reason we have to debate this. And this goes back to Mr. Rose at the Dallas hospital. Okay. If Rose would have done the autopsy, we probably would not have to be answering these questions right now.
So, Jim, is there any truth to, because I had read that Jackie didn't want them to do a comprehensive autopsy, that she was very, I don't know, and I can't remember where I had read that, but I think, who was it? Who was the admiral? Was it Berkeley?
Berkeley was a personal physician.
Galloway was the one running it, though, right, Jim?
Galloway was the guy who was really the chief of Bethesda. Yes.
So okay, and he wanted them to hurry it along, right? He didn't want them to do a complete autopsy.
Galloway.
Look,
right? Okay, and he was
Gary Aguilar has looked at this issue very thoroughly. Okay, and he even found secret testimony by Humes. Okay. And Hume said nobody from the Kennedy family interfered with us. Okay. There was no interference from them. They weren't even in the room. Okay.
Right.
And so if there was any interference, it was from the people in the actual room.
Right.
I mean, you talk to some of these guys like Floyd Reeve and Jenkins, and they'll tell you that they never saw an atmosphere like that in any autopsy they ever did. You know, they said, as an exaggeration, I think Reeby said it was like a carnival. Okay. You know, I never saw a procedure like this that's so haphazardly done, you know, and if you believe, um, you know, if you believe Paul O'Connor, and we put this in the film, you know, very interesting what Curtis LeMay was doing that day.
Right.
All right. He said that he was in Michigan. He wasn't in Michigan. He was in Canada. He was out of the country. You know what somebody said to me about that? He said he said he was probably there to be sure that the coup succeeded. He wanted to be out of the country if it failed.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay. All right. And so he wouldn't answer his aide de camp, Colonel Dorman. If you listen to the Air Force One tapes, all right, Dorman keeps on asking, you know, where are you right now? What's your progress? He never answers. You know, he never answers. Then he landed at the wrong airport. He was supposed to land at Andrews, and he didn't land at Andrews. He landed at National. You know, if you want to go conspiratorial on this, all the cameras were at Andrews. He would have been captured by some film. Okay. He goes to National, which, by the way, is closer to Bethesda also. And so there aren't any cameras there. All right. And then, of course, there's the great story that Oliver decided to put in the film about Humes telling O'Connor, go over there, that guy at the end of the gallery, please tell him to put out that cigar. And so O'Connor walks over to the end of the gallery, and he walks up and he says, oh my God, it's Curtis LeMay. And LeMay blows smoke on his face. All right. And he comes back to Humes and he says, I can't tell that guy to put that cigar out. That's Curtis LeMay. I can't.
And of course, Jim, there's very few people that hated Kennedy more than General LeMay.
Right. If anybody had a motive to blow the autopsy, it was Curtis LeMay. All right. And Alan Dulles and him were friends. This is why in the film, see, we didn't decide to do a whole conspiratorial setup, okay, about who really killed JFK, you know, how many assassins there were, who was running the conspiracy or that. We just made a couple of hints that we thought that the Pentagon and the CIA, and we singled out Dulles and LeMay, would be two examples of the people who were probably in on this thing.
Yeah, I think just pointing out that Oswald couldn't have done this is enough.
Well, I mean, come on. Sebastian Latona was the #1 fingerprint guy in America at that time. Bob Tannenbaum, a big New York City district attorney, told me, look, if you could get Latona to testify in your case, you felt lucky, because every DA in the country wanted him. Okay, because he had written a pamphlet that every police station in the country used as a guide for fingerprint analysis. Okay, so he gets the gun that night. All right, that night. It wasn't the next day, it was that night. Okay, he gets called in. Okay, he goes over the weapon, dusts the weapon, can't find any prints of value on the weapon. He then starts taking pictures. Okay, he brings in his own photographer. All right, and he said, we did side lighting, we did highlighting, we did every technique I knew to try and get pictures of prints off this rifle. And then comes desperation time, and he actually took the rifle apart. Okay, no prints of value on that rifle. See, that is so powerful, because Latona was such a great technician. You know, that people have attacked us by perverting that testimony. Steve Rowe is one of these guys who completely distorted what the real testimony was. But that's what Latona's bottom line was. Now, if there's no fingerprints, if it's the wrong rifle, okay, and if you have some very serious questions about CE-399, we could do a whole show about CE-399, okay, and then the secretaries on the fourth floor did not see or hear anybody coming down those stairs, you know, as Bob Tannenbaum says in the film, you couldn't convict Oswald with the Warren Commission's testimony in any court in America.
Jim, one thing on C399, can you tell about the medic Dolce, the expert that did the results on those?
Wasn't that guy terrific?
Oh, he was great.
Yeah, Joseph Dolce was one of these guys that Spectre knew would be fatal to his case. So he didn't put him on the stand. And I don't even think his testimony is in the Warren Commission. All right. Yeah, I don't think it is. All right. Joseph Dolce was a very experienced surgeon, a battlefield surgeon from World War II. And he was one of the people who did the ballistics tests, okay, on this case with, I think it was the actual rifle. All right. And they conducted experiments because, of course, you know, the Warren Commission says that CE-399 went through both Kennedy and Conley. All right. 7 perforations, smashing 2 bones, the wrist bone, okay, in Conley's right arm, and I think his 5th rib, all right, were both shattered. All right. Well, Dolce said they gave us 100 bullets. We tried to reconstruct the crime. We shot and we shot and we shot and we shot. And we could not come up anything close to what the way CE-399 looks, okay, today. All right. And Wecht likes to put these pictures in a little montage series of photographs. And you will see that none of those bullets looks anything like CE-399, which is pretty much undamaged.
Right.
Okay, is, you know, all you have is a flattening at the back of the bullet, which you get with almost any projectile going out the barrel of a gun. All right, you know, and the little lack of lead at the bottom, that's because the FBI took out some of the lead to do some testing on it. But other than that, the bullet is pretty much unscathed, okay, as they say, you know, and that's very, very, very hard to believe. All right, if you think that, you know, this thing went through 2 people, you know, smashing 2 bones, ending up in Conley's left thigh, doing a reverse trajectory because it somehow fell out, okay, and it ended up on the wrong stretcher, okay. I really wish we'd have put that in there about being on the wrong stretcher, because if you've read Thompson's book 6 Seconds in Dallas, he does about 10 pages on this, okay, and he pretty much proves that Tomlinson had the wrong stretcher. This is another problem that Spectre had. And his examination of Tomlinson is a joke. Okay. It would never pass in any court of law because he was leading the witness. All right. And then you get O.P. Wright. I mean, O.P. Wright was a very good witness because he used to work in the sheriff's department under Decker. Okay. And so he had a lot of experience with firearms and bullets. Okay, and so when Thompson went to interview him, he happened to have a picture of CE-399 with him. Okay, and Wright says, "That's supposed to be the bullet that I showed the Secret Service." And Thompson goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "No." He goes, "That's not the bullet." And because he was chief of security, he opened up his desk drawer and said, "This is the way the bullet looked. It's a pointy-nosed bullet." And Thompson, in his last book, Last Second in Dallas, he actually added on to this and said O.P. Wright was so disturbed that he followed him out the door. Okay. And he said, that picture is in the Warren Commission? And Thompson said, yes. He,
Wow.
he couldn't believe it, and that's why Spector never interviewed him. Now, that tells you the whole story, doesn't it?
Yes.
Spector did not interview
No question.
Dolce.
Yeah.
He did not interview Wright. Okay. So he knew what was going on.
Right.
In Epstein's book, Assume Nothing, he reveals for the first time what I think it's because Spector's dead. Okay. What Spector actually told him about the whole single bullet theory thing. Okay. And he said, look, we have to go with this thing, because if we don't go with this thing, we have to find a second assassin.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so he presented this to the Warren Commission. He showed him the Zapruder film and said, if you don't buy the single bullet theory, if you don't buy my idea, then we have to start investigating for a conspiracy. And they obviously didn't want to do it. Spector didn't want to do it. Okay.
Jim, can you talk a little bit about the Harper fragment?
Okay. The Harper fragment is a piece of bone that was discovered in Dealey Plaza, I believe about within 24 hours after the assassination. The guy's name was Billy Harper. Okay. And he picked it up, and there's a debate about where it was found. Okay. So I won't get into that. But he brought it to a hospital, and 3 forensic pathologists examined it. All right. And all 3 of these guys in Dallas said that in their professional opinion, it was occipital bone. Occipital bone is part of the back of the skull that is about in the middle of the back of the skull. All right. Parietal is on the side, more on the side of the skull. Okay. And they said that in their opinion, it was occipital. Well, the FBI picked it up. They brought it to Washington, and Berkeley had it. And like so many other things, like Kennedy's brain, it disappeared. Okay. So all we have is pictures of it today. All right. And there's a very serious question. If the doctors reconstructed Kennedy's skull that night, which they say they did, how could they do it without the Harper fragment? Because they didn't have it that night. Okay. It's a very serious question. And Dave Mantic has done a very good study of this. Okay. And he believes that it was occipital bone, and it did come from the middle part where the doctors did not reconstruct the skull. Okay. And it fits in to that middle part. All right. This is another problem, that was never gone into by the Warren Commission. See, if you go into all these things, Stringer, okay, the back of the skull, the non-dissection of the brain, the disappearance of the brain, the non-dissection. If you go into all these matters that the Warren Commission never touched upon, all right, then you see, what an absolute travesty of justice that the Warren Commission report really was. And this is why these guys on the commission, people like Spector, people like Leibler, people like David Bellin, okay, people who are still alive, I think Griffin is still alive, why these people have to defend, and why they feel so persecuted. Okay, because they should feel persecuted because they did such a crappy job. And if it wasn't for the media, to protect them, they would have been exposed a long time ago. Let me ask you a question. How can anybody read 888 pages in one day and then put together a program about it that night?
Right.
Okay. Well, that's what NBC and CBS did. Okay. They got the one report and they put programs on the air, okay, saying that, and in fact, in the NBC show, they just read right from the report. All right. Okay. So how can you do it? And the answer is you can't do it. Okay. So obviously, they were getting help from the Warren Commission, leaks, etc., witnesses,
Right.
etc. Okay, in advance of it coming out.
They have a hard enough problem with a 20-page indictment that they get.
You know, so the idea that they're going to read 888 pages, no,
Right.
no.
Right.
And they never got called on this. They never got called on this till many, many years later. I believe that's unethical journalism. All right, I really do. Because obviously the Warren Commission report had a spin to it. I mean, spin is more like a Maytag dryer in high gear,
Yeah.
you know? All right. So,
Jim,
you know,
can I get back to the Harper? And I don't want to open up a whole can of worms here, but because this is the first I've heard.
What else have we been doing?
I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
But so was he a civilian?
Yes.
Yeah.
How does a civilian have access to the crime scene?
Oh, this, like I said, this was within 24 hours. It wasn't that day. Okay. It was a little bit later.
You would think that area would have been
a thorough
taped
crime
off
scene. You think they would have found it?
Right. I mean, you would think they would have taped that entire area off.
Right. Well, wouldn't you think? You would have thought that if they were really doing a search, that a policeman would have found it.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
But evidently they did not. You know?
Unbelievable.
And Jim, one thing here, could you tell the story about Gerald Ford, what he did with the picture and moving the back wound to line up with the throat wound? Because that's just absolutely incredible.
When the ARB got the first drafts of the Warren Commission report from J. Lee Rankin's son, okay? J. Lee Rankin, of course, was the chief counsel for the Warren Commission. They looked at it and they noticed that Gerald Ford had moved the back wound from the back to the neck, okay? And it's right there in the report. He crossed it out, and he crossed out the word neck, back, and put in neck. All right. Now, any person who's familiar with the case would immediately suspect that Ford understood that there was a problem with the single bullet theory. Okay. All right. And if you put the wound in the back, that would make the problem even more obvious. How could the wound in the back actually change trajectory upward, okay, and exit through the front of the throat?
Right.
Right. And so what happened is, what exposed this thoroughly is that years later, what happened is that pictures of the autopsy got out, and some of them were actually in the House Select Committee volumes. And you can clearly see that the wound is in the back. Okay, it's not in the neck. Now, there's been this debate about the autopsy pictures in the Warren Commission. When the executive hearings of the Warren Commission were finally declassified in the 90s, it became clear that the Warren Commission did have access to the autopsy materials. And there's an executive session meeting in which McCloy asked this question. And Rankin says, words to the effect, yeah, we have them in this safe room. Okay. All right. So they did have access to the autopsy pictures. Now, whether or not Ford looked at one or more, that's another question. But the Warren Commission sure as heck knew that the wound was not in the neck, it was in the back. And for Ford, when this came out, by the way, Ford said that there was nothing there was nothing unethical about this. I was just trying to be anatomically correct.
Oh my God.
Oh.
Okay. Well, if you were anatomically correct, why were you wrong? Okay. Why were you so wrong about it? Okay.
Oh, that's unbelievable. So, Jim, I have one more question. I don't know, Sean, if you have anything else, but my question is, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, or if there even is an answer. But do you know if the Kennedy family, ever requested to have a private autopsy done?
Well, did the Kennedy family request a private? I've never heard of that.
Okay.
Now, that's not to say it wasn't done, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
that I never heard of that request. No,
I wonder why they wouldn't have done that. I mean,
I think it was because JFK had served in the armed forces in World War II. Okay, and so um, Jackie suggested that he get a Navy autopsy on the plane backward. That's at least a story in Manchester's book. All
mhm.
right.
Okay.
And it might have had something to do with Berkeley also. You
And
know,
Jim,
Berkeley's a very interesting
right.
character.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about to end it, because I know we've been going on here quite a while. But let's talk about some of the revelations you had on Berkeley and that you put in the film, because some of those are just amazing. Some of the stuff he said afterwards.
Well, Berkeley, on at least, I believe, 3 occasions, stated that he had a problem with the official story. Okay, I think it was once with an interview we did with the JFK Library in 1964. It was once with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, all right, where he wrote a letter to Dick Sprague that was kind of interesting, all right. And it was once with Michael Kurtz, who is an historian who wrote a book on the JFK case, all right. And he said, for example, the JFK Library interview, they actually asked him about the Warren Commission verdict, this 3 shots. And he said words to the effect, uh, I would not care to comment on that. Now, what tops this all off is that the ARB wanted to try and get Berkeley's files, all right, because they thought there might be something in there. And they got in contact with Berkeley's daughter. And she said, fine, I'll be glad to sign off on that. All right. And so when the ARB got the document ready and they're ready to mail it to her, she changed her mind. She now didn't want to. Well, wouldn't that kind of indicate somebody got to her? Okay. About turning those files over.
Sounds like
And
it. Yeah.
the other reason that Berkeley is so interesting is not just because of what he said or did not say.
He was at
It's
both hospitals.
he was the only physician that was at both Parkland and Bethesda. And he's the one who signed off on the death certificate. And the death certificate puts the back wound at T3, which is much too low to go out the throat.
Right.
Okay. T3 would be about where it is in JFK's shirt. Okay. Approximately where it is in JFK's shirt, you know. So that would be a very serious problem. And I also believe, and I think we showed this in the film, that he signed off on the Boswell sketch sheet, which is an anatomical drawing of all the wounds, okay, and marks on the body. And in that face sheet, it's about a T3. And Berkeley's signature was on it, except it was erased for the copy in the Warren Commission. All right. Now, can you imagine never questioning Berkeley about either one of those things?
Unbelievable.
You know, you know. And so this is why a lot of people believe that Berkeley was a very, very important witness in this case. All right. And the HSCA did not cross-examine Berkeley. All right. They just sent him a series of questions on a piece of paper that he answered.
Unbelievable.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Coming up on 60 years.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Jim, this has been fantastic. The documentary, which we strongly recommend everybody, it's got to be mandatory viewing, is JFK Revisited Through the Looking Glass. There's a 2
And
hour,
the book too, the book.
and the book as well. There's a 2-hour version of the documentary. Is that still on Showtime, Jim? Is that still-
No, I think that contract has run out.
Okay.
Okay, they had it for 2 years.
Okay.
Right. So if you want to get it now, you stream it. There's about 7 different platforms that you can stream it on. Of course, Amazon being one. I think Hulu's another, Vudu's another.
Mhm.
Okay. You can stream it. You can either stream it by part, okay, or you can stream it the whole thing. And it's very reasonably priced. The DVD. Now, this is really something that's amazing when you think about it. The movie was released at the Cannes Film Festival 2 years ago. Okay. And the DVD was released about 11 months ago. Okay. 11 months ago. All right. Right now, if you check on Amazon, DVD sales for documentaries, it's number 3.
Wow.
It's number 3 after 11 months.
That's amazing. That's
Okay,
great.
it's
Yeah.
number 3. And of course, there's the book also. The book, see, if we wanted to, if we were allowed to, let me correct that. We could have easily had a 6-hour film. All
Sure.
right. Because the strength of the film is the fact that we have so many luminaries in the picture. Okay. It's an all-star cast, and there's a total of approximately 30 people that we interviewed for the film. So we couldn't get all of it in. It was impossible. So we took some of the interviews that we had left and we put that in the book. I think there's 28 interviews in the book. So you'll see people like Wecht, like Jeff Morley, like Henry Lee, etc., and many others. What we couldn't put in the film, it's in the book. And it's almost as good as what's in the film. The other half of the book is the annotated screenplays. That is for both the 2-hour version and the 4-hour version. And we make it clear there where we got our information from. Okay. So that you don't think, like Tim Weiner. Okay, that what we just made stuff out of magic air. No, we didn't. Okay, it's all annotated.
And Jim, was that Oliver's idea to make Donald Sutherland one of the narrators? Because I think he's just brilliant.
Yeah, I really liked having Donald Sutherland.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I thought he did a nice job.
Yeah.
And then he did this casting against type with Whoopi Goldberg. Okay. He wanted Joan Allen. Okay, it was either her or the woman who played the DA in the film, but I can't remember her name now. But uh, he couldn't because she was tied up doing a play on Broadway. Okay. And so then he asked Whoopi Goldberg. Okay. And I thought she did a really good job. You
She
know,
did.
Oh,
I
she
thought
did.
she did a nice job. And
Yeah.
then he even went against type by having Sutherland do the Kennedy stuff and have Goldberg doing the forensic stuff. Okay. But like I said, I think it all came out well at the end.
Definitely.
Sutherland, I
Look,
mean, he was so key in the original film. His scene,
yes.
you know,
Yeah.
if you just wanted, you know, if you just saw that scene, that tells you everything you need to know.
Right. Right. Well, that scene, which you're talking about, where Kevin Costner meets him at the Lincoln Memorial and they walk down to the Washington Monument.
Right.
In that space of about 8 minutes, you essentially get the whole history of the CIA.
Yeah.
Okay. All the
Right.
terrible things the CIA has done
Right.
in the name of spreading democracy through the world. You know, and that had never been done, I believe, in a film, feature film before. So if millions of people for the first time actually saw it, you know, and as I've said, Sutherland, you know, he wanted Brando in that part. Okay. But Brando, I think Brando wanted too much money. Plus, there's no way in the world you're going to get him to memorize 8 minutes of dialogue.
Well, he could
Yeah.
no, he didn't memorize. We've done jokes about Brad. He doesn't
Yeah.
memorize. You've got to hold the cards.
So it's really a good thing, and it was a blessing in disguise because Sutherland nailed it.
Oh, he was fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, he was
Unbelievable.
terrific. Like I said, you know, they say that, you know, Jeremy Irons was a better Claus von Bülow than Claus von Bülow.
Right.
You know, Donald Sutherland was a better Fletcher Prouty than Fletcher Prouty.
He was.
You
He
know,
really was.
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well,
Jim,
thanks, Jim.
yeah, this has been fantastic. I mean, we've taken way too much of your time. We really appreciate it. And, you know, I'm sure we're going to ask you to come back. There's still so many things we haven't talked about. So, again, just really appreciate your time today.
Okay, you're very welcome.
All right.
Thanks, Jim.
Have a good day.
All right.
too,
Thank
Jim.
you.
Bye bye.
All right.
Bye,
Bye.
Jeff.